Well, welcome to this webinar of the Wilberforce Institute. As I mentioned just immediately before, my name is Trevor Burnard. I'm the director of the Wilberforce Institute and a historian of early America, mainly concentrating on places further south than what is going to be the subject of today's talk, today's webinar, which is slavery in Massachusetts. This is the second and what we hope will be an annual event looking at particular areas in the history of transatlantic slavery, areas which are attracting concentrated research, excellent research, and research whereby people tend to disagree with each other. So this is meant to be a forum where we're expecting to have a variety of views put forward about a particular subject. And slavery in Massachusetts is very much a subject of concentrated research, excellent research findings, and disagreement about what those research findings might be. You might wonder why we're thinking about Massachusetts. Last year's webinar was on Tacky's Rebellion in Jamaica, a place where 90% of the population were enslaved Africans in the middle of the 18th century. In Massachusetts, the demography was very different. Our panelists will argue, and I'm sure that's one of the things that they will agree on, is that slavery was by no means marginal to 18th century, 17th and 18th century Massachusetts. It was not, however, the dominant institution as it was in Jamaica, though very, very important, as our panelists will point out, in a variety of ways. What we hope to show in this webinar is why slavery mattered in Massachusetts, what was important about it, what was distinctive about it, and also to talk about not only how what were the major features of slavery in this period, but also about how slavery ended. So we have three speakers, each of whom will talk for 10 to 15 minutes each, and then two distinguished commentators, Charmaine Nelson and Mark Peterson. I'll introduce each speaker in turn and before they give their talks. So our first speaker is Margaret Newell, who is Professor of History at The Ohio State University, who's a specialist on New England, working on a variety of areas to do with New England, first of all to do with the New England economy, and then publishing in 2016 a prize-winning and brilliant book, Brethren by Nature, New England and Indians, Colonists, and the Origins of American Slavery. She also very recently published in 2020 a book with a number of colleagues called As If She Were Free, a collective biography of women and emancipation in the Americas. And she also has an essay in a very good book published by Sophie White and another editor on hearing enslaved voices. So Margaret, over to you to talk to us about your views on slavery in Massachusetts.
Thank you so much, Trevor. I'm thrilled to be joining this audience and this very distinguished group of panelists, and I'm looking forward to an exciting discussion with all of the attendees. So Trevor had keyed up a few questions for us to consider as presenters, and one was why understanding slavery in Massachusetts is important. And as you can probably tell from the title of my book that Trevor just read out, I see Massachusetts as an important part of the story of slavery's origins in colonial America and colonial English America. And I imagine all of the panelists will address this question, but slavery in the North remains very understudied. You know, we have this image of slavery as a 19th century phenomenon in the US and the Caribbean, or late 18th century, of one involving enslaved Africans, plantation agriculture. And in fact, slavery in the North is a different story. It's a story about enslaved people working in households. It's a story about indigenous people being a primary source of slave labor in the 17th century and continuing to be enslaved into the 18th century. That even in the Caribbean, 10% of the enslaved were indigenous people. It is a story of people working in a variety of activities and industries, taking care of children, cooking, doing the key household tasks to feed the family. And households are also a center of production for the market. So these labor in households was actually producing the goods that the New England economy was shipping out into the world. And where were they shipping those goods? They were often shipping them to other to slave societies, to the tobacco planters of Virginia, and to the sugar planters of the Caribbean. So New England became the place that fed slave societies throughout the Atlantic world and engaged in trade with them. So for this, and then finally, I'd say that New England has always held a sort of special place in the historiography of early America for American historians. We used to talk about New England exceptionalism. It was seen as a place that helped explain American religiosity, that helped explain American democracy, a pivotal place in the coming of the American Revolution, and a source of early presidents and economic booms of the Industrial Revolution and so on. So a pivotal region and a region associated with democratic ideals. So I think if we see slavery as part of that history, then that means we have to revise our not only our narrative of New England, but our entire master narrative of colonial English society and the America that emerged from it. So my contribution to today's discussion, of course, is going to be on Indigenous slavery. And so that has been my main intervention in the literature, which was Trevor's second point that he wanted us all to address. And I'd like to start by saying that my piece of the story, my focus on New England, is just part of a hemispheric story of the enslavement of Native Americans that all European empires engaged in. And I think we need to think about Indigenous slavery as part of the colonial project. From the earliest contact, enslavement of Native Americans was part of what Europeans did when they engaged in encounters. Enslavement of Native Americans funded colonization, helped pay for colonization, and became both, therefore, a kind of means of colonization and an end itself of colonization. Captive Indians were paraded in the streets and taverns of England in the late 1600s, the late 1500s, including Native Americans from New England. Native Americans from New England were kidnapped to return as pilots and planners by colonizing ventures in New England and in what is now Maine. We also have to think about the ways in which enslavement of Native Americans was part of their dispossession, was part of the incredible, and I would say genocidal pressure put on Native Americans by European colonization, displaced from their land, separated from the means of their own subsistence, their farms under pressure, the various places where they gathered resources under pressure, and their very labor, the labor they needed for subsistence, placed under pressure by the taking of this labor in the form of enslavement. So this has an impact on Native American demography, on subsistence, on on sort of a long-term presence throughout New England, so that there's a relationship between dispossession from land, enslavement, and a kind of ongoing dialectic. But we also need to maybe rethink our image of New England when we think about the presence of enslaved Native Americans in households. We think about the Winthrop family that provided governors, early governors of both Massachusetts and Connecticut. John Winthrop Sr. listed 9 indigenous slaves in a draft will that he wrote in 1639. From its very inception, the magistrates, the ministers, leaders of these New England colonial enterprises were the ones most engaged in obtaining and owning indigenous slaves. And I argue in my book that Massachusetts's 1641 Body of Liberties, it's the first legal code in English America, also produced the first law of slavery, and I'll be showing you an image of that shortly. So I'd say my biggest interventions in this literature are sort of figuring out what the arc of indigenous slavery was, and applying the term slavery to a broad range of involuntary unpaid work. And in this, I follow in the footsteps of or agree with what some other historians who are working on the West, the Southwest, New France, and other imperial regions. So one of the things we did was really start calling slavery, applying the term slavery to what maybe other historians had bypassed or not really regarded as being, true slavery. And I think this is partly because of our strong association of slavery with Africans. It's sort of an ethnic blind spot. So that in some ways we needed a paradigm shift, a new way of thinking, that opened up or made us actually see the material and the sources that had been sitting right in front of us. So I imagine Mark has had this experience, since he and I have been at this a little bit longer than some of the other panelists and have written about other aspects of New England culture, is that the records are full of material on indigenous people and on slavery. And I think people, so for generations, people were writing books and just sort of skipping over this material, just simply not seeing material that was sort of sitting right in front of our faces. So in some ways it required a new way of thinking, and maybe thinking about slavery in a broader, more flexible way. So in the earlier stages of enslavement in New England, we see this period of kidnapping and trafficking that's going on throughout the Atlantic world. It's going on in the Caribbean, it's going on in Virginia, and any place the English are colonizing. But the enslavement in New England entered a new phase in a period of intense warfare with Native American nations, beginning with the Pequot War in 1637-38, and continuing on into King Philip's War in 1676-1677. So I think that slavery is both a cause, a contributing factor, and a major effect of these Anglo-Indian wars. So these are big periods or big events that bring a lot of indigenous people into enslavement. Perhaps up to 40% of the survivors of King Philip's War in New England end up enslaved. And once the New England governments absorb or exert jurisdiction over indigenous groups in southern New England, they're no longer at war with them. There's not these opportunities in warfare to enslave. So I see a phase that I call judicial enslavement, in which Indians are enslaved by the courts. So as many as 2/3 of Native Americans who appear before courts in Plymouth County in Massachusetts with a debt case or a civil case, theft, etc., end up being sentenced to involuntary servitude. And once Native Americans were in the system as servants or slaves, it was not uncommon for masters to simply begin claiming these involuntary servants as slaves, or to trafficking them out of the local area and then selling them as enslaved people. So that the conversion of free people, or people that were supposed to be limited time servants or bond servants, into slavery is also a factor of how slavery operated in New England. It's so hard. It's sort of these extra legal modes of converting free people into enslaved people are a feature of the New England landscape. And so I'd like to share a few slides and show some of the sources and sort of the themes that I think are both important parts of my research, but also maybe help us get at some of the work that other folks are doing. We can. Okay, I'm hoping everybody can see this.
Yeah.
See this? Yep. Okay.
Yep.
So I mentioned the Winthrops a moment ago. Here's Governor John Winthrop in the center, and an Elizabethan gentleman in New England, and his son John Winthrop Jr. on the right. To the left is an individual that was actually a captive in the Pequot War, who ended up in the Winthrop household, who managed to gain his freedom, Cassa Cinnamon, who became the founder of the Mashantucket Pequot people, who are still in existence today. But even before the Pequot War, here you see below, the Winthrops were petitioning for the right to have Native Americans in their households, an Indian apiece. And so John Winthrop Jr.'s children became slaveholders of both Native Americans and of Africans in Connecticut and Boston. John Winthrop Jr. And his brother Dean both spent time in Spain, where they certainly saw the major slave markets in the Mediterranean and in Spain. Another son, Dean, became a slaveholder in Medford, Massachusetts, an estate that produced one of the only remaining slave quarters in Massachusetts. And a son, Samuel, became a sugar planter, slaveholder in the Leeward Islands. John Winthrop Sr.'s son, Henry, was in Barbados and participated in the conversion of indigenous people into slaves there and the importation of enslaved Africans there. So you see these families that are global and Atlantic, that are participating in slavery in all of its facets, indigenous and African. So I make much of the of the law of slavery in Massachusetts, and here's Massachusetts's 1641 code under bond slavery, and it says there should be no bond slavery except, and then lists the categories at which people are allowed to be enslaved: those who willingly sell themselves or who are sold to us, and captives in just wars, and you can see the captives in just wars as a pretext for the taking of indigenous people in warfare. But the final element here is that the state, the authority, has the right to assign people to enslavement. So these were the methods by which indigenous people were enslaved, and then later the justification for continued enslavement of Africans. And I think the timing of this war, following right on the heels of the Pequot conflict, which brought Native Americans into English households. These two things, these are linked events. Now, I mentioned earlier the King Philip's War. Here's a document that produced by John Hull, a merchant who served as a treasurer of Massachusetts during King Philip's War. And you can see here it's a record. So the colony of Massachusetts and the colony of Plymouth held auctions of captives, and these were refugees, these were women and children, these were non-combatants in many cases. And here, so this document sort of shows you some of the buyers, and we know that Shrimpton sent some of the people he purchased to Jamaica, and soldiers were buying and selling Indians on the battlefield, taking captives, as Thomas Oliver says here in this quote, and selling them to others. Some of the captives sold in these giant auctions ended up dispersed throughout the Atlantic world in a kind of reverse Middle Passage. So here we see Captain Thomas Hamilton of the English Navy in Tangier, which had come under English possession in the reign of Charles II, went to a Cadiz slave market and purchased New England Indians captured in King Philip's War, and made them galley slaves. You can see these English galleys. The English were experimenting with galleys in the Mediterranean, and he thought they were better than the Moorish slaves. New England enslaved Indians also helped construct this breakwater or mole stonework around the harbor. So in the 18th century, aside from judicial enslavement, the Massachusetts also partly because of its aggressive enslavement during King Philip's War, provoked decades of warfare with indigenous groups on its northern borders, the Wabanaki Confederacy. And in the same period, English colonization was moving down from Virginia into the Carolinas. So there's a trade of war captives continued from both the North and from the South. So this ad appeared in the Boston Newsletter in September of 1711, or news item, and it shows what I think you could really call a slave uprising, a mass escape of Native Americans from the Carolinas and from Spanish missions in La Florida had been captured by combined Native American and English slave parties and slave raiders who raided this region beginning in the late 17th and into the 18th century, and trafficked these people all over the place, including to New England. So enslavement in New England included people from other regions, including Indonesia, where all these people were lumped into the category of Indian. So this is a great ad because it shows, who owned these Native Americans, what sorts of tasks they might have been put to. And it also shows, the ways in which Native Americans resisted enslavement. So I also see Native American slavery as creating a distinct slave regime in New England. So that the way that slavery evolved in New England was different, I argue, because of the presence of Native Americans. So that law of slavery I showed you a moment ago didn't change very much. New England colonies adopted these so-called slave codes that placed limits on the right of assembly and bearing arms, created separate legal codes for people of color, and it started taxing them as livestock possessions rather than people. And these laws included Indian servants and slaves in their provisions, so dehumanizing, racializing servitude, and putting Indians in the same category as Africans if they were in servitude in any form. But the heritability of slavery in New England and other aspects that other English, French, and Spanish colonies decided in favor of, yes, slavery was heritable. These were not clear in law in New England. And New England also, enslaved people retained the right to testify in court, to marry, as Gloria, our other panelist, Gloria Whiting, has published really interestingly about. And so they retained certain rights that they lost in some other slave societies. And I think this is partly because of the fact that Indians were the predominant group. And there's always contestation, even amongst the English colonists, about the appropriateness of enslaving Indians, the justifications for it, viewing them as allies, as fellow human beings, as potential Christians. You know, that there's contestation over enslavement at every step by Indigenous people, but also by people within these communities, within these English communities, about whether this is the right thing to do. So this is a freedom suit brought by a man named Caesar. His name appears at the top here. And you see that he's identified it as a Musti, right? So part African, part Native American or Indian, servants to Samuel Richards, or slave. There's so there's little indentations, carets, cross-outs all through this document, which suggests that Caesar's ethnicity and his very status were in question. So Caesar brought the suit because his mother had been a child refugee in King Philip's War. He was auctioned off at a dock and purchased by a sea captain. She was only supposed to be a servant for a fixed term, a term as long as 25 or 30 years, but not for life. So Caesar brought the suit claiming that his mother had been illegally held as a slave for life, and that he was being illegally held as a slave because of her illegal enslavement. So what I see in this sort of period of freedom suits is claims of indigeneity tended to help people succeed in bringing freedom suits. And these freedom suits also exposed the extra-legal, illegal, ongoing enslavement of Indigenous people and their children, and received support from juries and from lawyers who helped prepare these cases. So I argue that these cases reflect some of the racial complexities that were emerging in an increasingly mixed race population of servants and slaves in New England as African slavery became more prominent, but also a incipient anti-slavery movement in New England. So I think I'll stop there, and we'll hopefully continue our discussion after we hear from our other presenters. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Margaret. That was wonderful. I'd like to introduce now Jared Hardesty, who's an associate professor at Western Washington University on the west coast of America. So he's up very early this morning. Jared is a specialist in a variety of things, but in particular, he's worked extensively on slavery in Boston and on its hinterlands, which has resulted already in 3 books, including the book I think which is the one which he talks about Boston most particularly, which is Unfreedom, Slavery and Dependency in 18th Century Boston, published in 2016. He's extending his range now to work on slavery in other parts of the Atlantic world, including Suriname, and has a book forthcoming, which I recommend to people, called The Case of a Rising Sun, a tale of smuggling, murder, and chocolate in early America. And if a title like that's not going to get you interested, I don't think any title will. So, Jared, over to you.
Thank you, Trevor, for the kind introduction, and thank you to the staff of the Wilberforce Institute for arranging the panel. Once again, Trevor, for the introduction. My fellow panelists for joining. Really, well, a group of people I very much respect their work and look forward to their conversation, and all of you in the audience for attending. Trevor asked that we address 3 questions in our opening comments today, which Margaret already has. Why slavery and its abolition in Massachusetts are important, how my work contributes to the literature on slavery and abolition in Massachusetts, and the points of debate in the field that are most interesting and contentious. And so I'm going to take each of these in turn here this morning for me, afternoon for you all. So why are slavery and its abolition in Massachusetts important? I have 2 answers to that. Margaret already touched on one of them, which is the sources, and I'll come back to that a bit later in my comments. And second, where I'll focus my attention now, was the place of Massachusetts in the world of Atlantic slavery. Before getting into this second point, I'd like to note that so much of my answer to it and much of the current literature on slavery in Massachusetts, New England, is written in reaction to slavery in the region being dismissed as unimportant, or even slavery's non-existent. I'll hear this question every once in a while, that, oh, slavery didn't exist there. So a lot of it's written in reaction. And so in my initial draft of my comments today, I wrote out why this has been the case, but I'd run out of time if I got into it. So I hope we can get into this question of why it's been written off as unimportant in the Q&A. Thus, to understand the importance of slavery in Massachusetts is to reject arguments that downplay its significance or write it off as so exceptional and marginal as not to matter. Instead, for me, the significance of slavery in Massachusetts becomes apparent when we think about it more systemically, when we think about it as part of slavery across the early modern Atlantic world, and as Massachusetts as one node in that larger system of slavery, and that was connected to other slave societies. In this reframing, Massachusetts was central to upholding slavery across the Atlantic world, and especially in the British Empire. Why? Well, Margaret got into some of these reasons already, but I'll give you 4 reasons why Massachusetts was so important. The first is provisioning. Colonists in New England, merchants and farmers, provisioned West Indian and southern mainland plantations with agricultural goods, timber, saltfish, and livestock, even going so far as breeding special types of livestock for plantation conditions, the Suriname horse, for example. Second, Massachusetts ships carried sugar and molasses to markets all around the Atlantic. Third, Massachusetts merchants supplied manufactured goods made in Britain and North America to plantation societies. And fourth, Massachusetts merchants were players in the slave trade, especially in the inter-American slave trades, a little bit in the transatlantic slave trade. That's more Rhode Island than Massachusetts, but nonetheless, they are actively involved in the slave trade. So slavery in Massachusetts, then, in the colony itself and later state, was both a response to this wider world of slavery, especially when faced with labor shortages, and an outgrowth of the provisioning system. So industries in Massachusetts that were connected to provisioning, such as farming for the market, shipbuilding, distilling, and sailing, relied heavily on enslaved labor. So, for example, it's been estimated that 25% of enslaved men of African descent, and I imagine quite a few of indigenous descent as well, in eastern Massachusetts were sailors during the 18th century. Second, having close contact with so many different plantation societies also gave colonists in Massachusetts access to enslaved people, to purchase enslaved people to supplement other trades. So, for example, if you look at Boston in the 18th century, one of the largest group of slaveholders are bakers. And it has to do with the baking market, the bread market in 18th century Massachusetts. There's price controls. And so one way to save on costs was to use slave labor. And they buy enslaved people to enter household service, domestic service, things like service valets, coachmen, things like that as well. So this access to enslaved people through this trade and results in a number of people and industries investing in enslaved labor in Massachusetts itself. So in short, when studying Massachusetts slavery systematically, we see its importance to upholding slavery elsewhere and how and why slave labor was vital locally. While certainly idiosyncratic, I won't deny that there's some really unique features of slavery in New England and Boston, Massachusetts, and we'll probably come back to that in the Q&A. Slavery was just as quotidian, ubiquitous, and normal in Massachusetts as in other parts of the Americas. So it leads to that second question that Trevor posed for us to answer. How does my work contribute to the literature on slavery and abolition in Massachusetts? I start from what I just said, that Massachusetts, we should study it systemically as part of a wider world of Atlantic slavery as a starting premise. My work has always imagined slavery in Boston, Massachusetts, New England as part of this larger world of slavery. I'm deeply inspired by Rebecca Scott's Degrees of Freedom, if any of you are familiar with that book, and how she describes slavery systematically, but with these kind of unique nodes that are within the system itself. So I've done this in two ways. The first is I take a transnational approach, looking for connections between Massachusetts and other slave societies, making comparisons between, say, Massachusetts and other slave societies, and putting Massachusetts in conversation with what's happening in other slave societies, the development of slavery in those places. The second is historicizing slavery in Massachusetts and its time and place, the early modern Atlantic world. So much of the older scholarship on slavery, race, and Black life in New England and the American North takes a teleological approach, looking at slavery in the region through the lens of emancipation. You're finding these older books that they start with, a chapter on slavery, and everything else that comes after is about the American Revolution, about emancipation, and so slavery is kind of always a prologue. I aim to study slavery on its own terms. I'm very much a colonial American historian in that sense, and that's the time period I'm comfortable in. So for me, emancipation and abolition is the epilogue, not the prologue, in my study, in my work on slavery in Massachusetts. These two approaches underpin my work in general, but especially the argument in my first book, Unfreedom. When I wrote Unfreedom, I realized that it was the first book to examine slavery in Boston exclusively. So framing really mattered to me. Like, how am I going to frame the argument? And I argue that 18th century Boston was not only part of a wider world of slavery, but bound labor more generally. As Aaron Fogelman and other scholars have shown, about 80% of the people who arrived in British America before the American Revolution were in some form of bondage, slavery, indentured servitude. In Boston, the enslaved population may not have been that large, comprising between 10, 12% of the population, maybe 15%, depending on your estimate. But it was one of many systems of bound labor independence. So slavery coexisted alongside indentured servitude, alongside apprenticeship, alongside more customary forms of dependence like marriage, like child, like being a child. This whole world exists, these things exist side by side. And so the driving question of Unfreedom then is, how does living in such a world of slavery and dependence shape the experiences of enslaved people, shape their lives, and what does that do to slavery in Boston? And you can see this in a couple of different ways. I'll give you two examples here. And the first is in the origins of enslaved people in Boston. There certainly were West Africans in Boston, many people born in West Africa, certainly, but there were also a large number of Creoles that were born in Massachusetts itself. Gloria's work really shows this, that there was a large native-born enslaved population in New England. There was a number of enslaved people who had been born in the Caribbean, who were oftentimes sold as children and trafficked to Boston to work in various trades and industries. You have, many of the West Africans that do live in Boston had actually spent time in the West Indies beforehand. And so they have both the African experience and the West Indian experience. So you have this really diverse set of origins. It's just as diverse as a place like Jamaica, right, where you have all these different African ethnicities, but it's just a bit different. And so you have a Creole population coming from different places, a West African population, and some West Africans who spent time in the Caribbean. So it's just kind of a unique set of origins that then shapes the institution of slavery and how enslaved people navigate their world. It also, this world of dependence, this world of slavery shaped the goals and aspirations of enslaved people. Living in a world of dependence created, I argue, a different incentive structure that encouraged enslaved people to seek autonomy and concrete material gains over an abstract freedom that was very different from our own modern liberal understandings of liberty. More recently, my work on moving beyond unfreedom, my work on Massachusetts, New England slavery has taken a bit of a different path, examining how Massachusetts interacted with the wider world of slavery. I take Mark Peterson's city-state of Boston as a starting point here to think about Boston's political economy in this early period and how it shaped Bostonians' behavior in the world. And so I've seen a number of different manifestations of this. My article I wrote called Creating an Unfree Hinterland, which is about a group of merchants who in the 1730s and 40s began buying up rural farms and then using enslaved labor on those farms. And it seems, and those farms become entirely geared towards market production. Essentially, these merchants are responding to changing economic forces, currency issues in Massachusetts, losing out to trade to the West Indies, provisioning trade to New York and Philadelphia. And so this is a response that they have to try to recapture some of that trade. The second, the book that Trevor mentioned, the Mutiny on the Rising Sun, about slavery and smuggling and chocolate, my new book coming out in October, it looks at a smuggling ring which is mostly operated by New Englanders, some of who live abroad in Barbados and Suriname, and they are trafficking African captives from Barbados to Suriname in exchange for a number of products, but mainly cacao, or as we know it, chocolate. And so we can see New Englanders kind of acting out in the world. I have a number of other ideas for moving this forward, and I'm happy to talk about those in the Q&A to see Massachusetts kind of merchants beyond the confines of the colony itself, acting out in this world of slavery. So finally, what points of debate in the field are most interesting and contentious? I take two approaches to this question. The first is the way the field interacts with the larger history and historiography of slavery and the discipline of history more generally. And the second are debates within the field itself. So let me start with the way this field, history of slavery in New England or Massachusetts, however you want to characterize it, interacts with the larger history and historiography of slavery. One of the most important questions, going back to that first part, that we still, I think there's still debate over, is why does slavery in Massachusetts matter? Why is it important? When there is such a demographic difference between, say, a place like Jamaica and a place like Massachusetts in terms of the size of the enslaved population. So why does that matter? How does it matter? This is still a question that's subject to some debate, and it's an interesting question too. The second, and I think this is really where scholars of slavery in Massachusetts can contribute, and that has to do with sources. Margaret, I think, said it best when she said, you can't look at the records of early Massachusetts and not encounter slavery, not encounter indigenous slavery, not encounter African slavery. It's everywhere in the sources. And New Englanders kept really excellent records. So we have the kind of private papers of prominent New Englanders, the diaries, the letters, the things like that. But we also have all sorts of public papers, especially probate inventories, wills, stuff like that, but also legal records. As Margaret noted, enslaved people could testify in court. So we have hundreds upon hundreds of testimonies of enslaved people, both African and indigenous. And of course, they're talking about the cases at hand, but they're also talking about their everyday experiences and lives. I actually would argue that these are the best sources for understanding enslaved people in the Anglophone world, in the English-speaking world before the 19th century. And if you take it together as a body, a corpus of sources taken together, they are the best sources before the 19th century. And those sources that give us glimpses of the lives of enslaved people, I think that creates an opportunity. So it's not only about an interesting and contentious debate, but an opportunity to contribute to larger debates about slavery in the Atlantic world writ large. Gloria has done this in her recent article in the William Mary Quarterly about probate inventories in Massachusetts that really shows how useful these sources can be to scholars of Atlantic slavery. So what about debates within the field itself? Well, one of the big debates, and I really look forward to talking about this too in the Q&A, is when did slavery in Massachusetts end? This is a huge question mark. It's not as simple as it ended on this date at this time for this reason. How did it end? Older narratives emphasize the court system in Massachusetts declared slavery illegal and it poof disappeared. That doesn't seem to be the case when you dig into the records. What did abolition and emancipation look like as it unfolded? Was it a top-down process, the courts declaring people free, or was it bottom-up from the actions of enslaved people and free blacks themselves? And is it an institutional emancipation or a popular emancipation? So this debate, I think it's fascinating to see it unfold. It's a very complicated process, and historians are really just now kind of starting to engage it and ask questions about it. And second are the debates about the lives of enslaved people in the region, both African and indigenous. The sources give us a lot of glimpses, lots of glimpses of the experiences, of the mentalities, to use that old school term, the mentalities of enslaved people, but just enough to spark contentious, I would argue, endless, possibly endless debates. And so the thing is, as conflict averse as I can be, this debate is particularly important to me. Talking about the lives of enslaved people, using the sources to talk about their lived experiences, their mindsets, because it shows scholars actively engaging the sources. It demonstrates that a critical mass of scholars are now working on slavery in Massachusetts. And I think most heartening to me, it illuminates how the field is starting to develop its own debates, paradigms, and internal logics that move beyond older ideas about slavery in Massachusetts. And even better, those ideas are being engaged by scholars in other fields. And so I'm going to leave my comments there, and I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you all so much.
Thank you very much, Jared. That was really, really interesting. We've moved along a little bit here at the moment. Just to say that we do encourage members of the audience to give questions for any individual or for the panel in general. If you could do this in two ways, either use the chat function on the right-hand side of your screen and type your message, and I will convey that question to the panelists individually or collectively, or indicate if you'd like to ask a question in person, I can do that. It's my great pleasure to introduce Gloria Whiting, who is the E. Gordon Fox Assistant Professor of History at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where she's been publishing prolifically in recent years while developing a manuscript on slavery in New England, published in particular in leading journals like the William Mary Quarterly, Slavery and Abolition, and the Journal of American History. And she is, as Jared pointed out, interested not only in slavery in Massachusetts, but also in emancipation and abolition. Over to you, Gloria.
Thank you, Trevor. Thank you so much for that introduction and for convening this session and inviting me to be part of it. It's truly an honor to be on a panel with scholars whose work has shaped my own thinking so much. And also a big thank you to the staff of the Wilberforce Institute for working behind the scenes to make this webinar run smoothly. So in one of Trevor's communications, he sent 4 big questions to help us plan what to speak on today. The first 3 revolved around the distinctiveness of slavery in Massachusetts, its importance, and the extent to which it can illuminate our understandings of slavery elsewhere. Now, each of these are big questions and could easily take up more than the time allotted to me. So I won't speak on them just now, but I wanted to flag them because I'd be happy to address them more in the Q&A session. For now, though, with Trevor's blessing, I've chosen to focus just on Trevor's final suggestion, which deals with the end of slavery in Massachusetts. I think this presentation will complement Margaret's and Jared's expansive visions of slavery in New England, because my contribution is going to be very tightly wound today. I wanted to provide you with a story of a Massachusetts person in slavery, and then I wanted to unpack that story. So I will start with the story. It's a story that prompted me to rethink what I thought I knew about slavery's end in Massachusetts. And then I will explain sort of some of the ways in which I re-engaged the archive in search of a more satisfactory narrative of abolition. And I'll go on to share some archival evidence I turned up, which is evidence that I found very surprising. And then I will end finally with that story. In summer 1775, a diminutive figure moved across the landscape of eastern Massachusetts. Darby Vassall, a Black child who had been born into slavery 6 years prior, walked from Woburn to Medford to Charlestown to Cambridge. At every turn, he encountered signs of war. Homes plundered by the British, tree limbs blasted by stray bullets, stone walls toppled by colonial snipers. The very air that hung around him, hot and heavy as a blanket, was punctured by the sound of artillery. And along the way, Darby likely crossed paths with refugees who had escaped from British-occupied Boston, whether secreted in fishing boats or rowed on rafts after dark. Refugees who brought with them nothing more than the clothes on their backs and tales of deprivation. For more than 10 miles, the boy pushed on through this destruction before arriving at his destination, the Cambridge mansion where his birth family had long been enslaved. Another person arrived on the premises soon after Darby. George Washington, the Virginia slaveholder who had recently been named commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. Darby was supposedly at play, swinging on the gate, guarding the way to the stately home when he first met George. Watching Darby on that gate, the towering slaveholder saw a child who needed a task with which to occupy himself. George therefore instructed the boy to go inside, where they would tell him what to do and give him something to eat. But Darby did not follow the general's orders. Instead, the child asked how much his wages would be. The commander-in-chief was taken aback. How could Darby be so unreasonable at such a time as to expect to be paid? But the 6-year-old did not consider the demand unreasonable at all, for as the story goes, he was feeling the value of his freedom. This snippet of a story connecting Darby and George is one of countless bits of antiquarian lore surrounding the wartime experiences of the first president of the United States. There are plenty of reasons to discount it. Its teller remains anonymous, for instance, and it was not even put to paper until nearly a century after it allegedly took place. Even more important, as I thought when I first read it, the story doesn't make sense. Why would this little boy, who had not been emancipated by his enslaver, believe himself to be free in 1775? Like all historians of New England, I knew that bondspeople in Massachusetts were liberated a decade later, nearly a decade later, after a 1783 court case in which a man of uncertain status named Quock Walker was found to be free on the basis of the state's 1780 Constitution, which declared all men free and equal. Darby's encounter with the general took place well before the court case. It took place well before the passage of the Constitution. The story must have gotten scrambled. But Darby's story, and many other anecdotes I came across, fit so poorly with historians' well-worked explanations of emancipation that I decided to test in the archive what we scholars thought we knew. The first place I turned was probate court, because there, white people made claims to enslaved property more clearly than just about anywhere else. I was astonished by what I found. Before the onset of the Revolution, probate records show that the system of slavery in the region was relatively robust. Now, this was not surprising. But from 1775 on, wills bequeathing human property all but disappeared, and bound laborers of African descent just about vanished from inventories of estates. What is more, the 1780 Constitution and the 1783 judicial decision influenced the rates of slaveholding in eastern Massachusetts? Not at all. The probate evidence seemed clear, but it ran so directly counter to the accepted interpretation of abolition in Massachusetts that I decided it was necessary to look elsewhere. Would other sources corroborate these findings? I turned first to print records, where I encountered a new category of persons being advertised in newspapers. Able-bodied but valueless slaves. People in the early years of the Revolution began advertising laborers like the so-called hardy Negro man, who was listed in 1776. His owner was so eager to send him off that he promised to pay whomever would take him. This was curious. Boston's weeklies had long offered young children to be given away, but people of full strength had always been for sale rather than for free. Newspapers show that others at this time started buying and selling African-descended people for terms rather than for life. And newspapers suggest as well that New Englanders living through the Revolution were increasingly willing to think of Black and white laborers in the same frame. Sometimes labor seekers posted notices equating one with the other. Consider, for instance, the household head who sought a white or Black servant man for his family, promising the laborer very large wages. Other bodies of archival sources confirm the changes evident in probate records and newspaper advertisements at the time. For instance, thousands of petitions were submitted to Massachusetts authorities in the early years of the Revolution, and some of these documents provide insight into the ways in which Black people themselves understood slavery and freedom in wartime Massachusetts. Consider the case of a man named Joseph Johnson. Joseph had been captured at sea and was living in Boston when he wrote, but even though he was, in his words, a free Negro man, he sensed that his autonomy was vulnerable. He was not worried about being reduced to bondage and forced to labor locally in Boston, though. Joseph feared enslavement elsewhere. He had been, as he put it, threatened to be sold and sent to Albany as a slave. A different petition elaborates on the point. Cuba, a 25-year-old woman of African descent, was captured by an American warship and brought to Boston in 1777. Once there, she rejoiced that she had been brought to this land of liberty, a place where she expected to spend her life in comfort and freedom. But Cuba, like Joseph, feared being sent away. She claimed that an officer on board the ship that captured her planned to have her sold as a slave and sent to Jamaica. And this officer seemed determined to stop at nothing. He pledged to carry out his scheme in spite of all courts and persons whatsoever. The officer's determination to ship Cuba to Jamaica, in spite of all courts and persons, reveals his expectation that he would need to counter both the local justice system and the local populace in sending the woman away. There is not time for a full-scale explanation or exploration of this point, but surviving evidence suggests that local inhabitants and lawmakers looked askance at attempts to ship captive Africans off to places where slavery stood on firmer practical and ideological grounds. The Massachusetts General Court outlawed this very practice in 1776. And it is clear that this ban was taken seriously based on evidence found in the papers generated by various Massachusetts authorities, such as the state's Commissary of Prisoners, the Massachusetts Council, and local court justices. Court records show us something else as well. In the Revolution's early years, bondspeople were leaving households where they had long been forced to labor. Take, for example, the case of Roger and Peg, husband and wife, who deserted in 1776 the house and service of Bostonian Thomas Walker. But they did not run away. They did not have to. Instead, they stayed in the town. working on their own. Their foiled master litigated for their return in a suit that provides still more confirmation of the degree to which slavery was faltering in Boston at the time. Rather than trying to obtain the return of enslaved laborers, Thomas based his case on Roger and Peg's supposed status as indentured laborers. But he need not have bothered. The case was tossed out of court. Other court records provide evidence that local people were questioning slavery in the early years of the Revolution, and that white inhabitants realized that they might not be able to claim the lives and labors of Black people much longer. For example, in 1777, Cato, described as an African by birth, arranged for a Boston man named Samuel Conant to be hauled into court for attempting to, quote, sell him, the said Cato, as a slave and transport him to foreign parts. The warrant suggests that local white people were looking to offload the enslaved, or those nominally in bondage, to places with more robust systems of slavery. And it suggests as well that the Massachusetts justice system took seriously the claims of Black inhabitants who found themselves victimized in this process. Cato, who feared foreign parts, like Cuba, who was terrified of Jamaica, and Joseph, who dreaded passage to Albany, appealed to local authorities in an attempt to keep himself in a place where the system of slavery was caving in all around him. There are more archival finds I could share, but my allotted time is pretty much up. So let us return to Darby, the little boy who supposedly left the home of his enslaver, walked 10 miles across a war-torn region to rejoin his family, and then impertinently instructed George Washington to pay him for his labor. Did Darby really do these things? We cannot really know, but my reassessment of the archive has wholly altered my understanding of this story. Darby's story absolutely makes sense. It could indeed have happened. In fact, it better follows the course of emancipation in Massachusetts, as revealed in a deep dive into the archive, than does the narrative of abolition that I and my fellow scholars have long believed. And Darby's story has everything to do with the Revolution. Revolutionary ideas about rights and liberty, along with the chaos of war, made the context right for a bound population fiercely determined to obtain independence, to liberate itself. And so, Darby and countless others simply walked away. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Gloria. That was terrific. I'd like now to turn over to a couple of commentators who will talk about these papers and what they suggest. And first person we'd like to turn to is Charmaine Nelson, who is who will give us a perspective on slavery in Massachusetts from a Canadian point of view. Charmaine is an art historian, previously professor of art history at McGill University, visiting professor at Harvard and other places, and is now professor of art history in Mascad, Nova Scotia, and Canada Research Chair in Transatlantic Black Diasporic Art and Community Engagement. She's the founding director of the Institute for the Study of Canadian Slavery and the author of many books, one of which is the most important, is on slavery, geography, and empire in 19th century marine landscapes in Montreal and Jamaica, and very interested in and actively involved in public engagement about Canadian slavery. Just to remind people too that please send your questions in if you'd like to do that, so we can put them forward to members of the panel. But Charmaine, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Trevor, for welcoming me and including me. Thank you to the other panelists, to your wonderful colleagues at Hull, and to the audience, of course. So how I'm going to engage here is by sharing an introduction to Canadian slavery, and I hope to demonstrate the ways that it was very much parallel to what was occurring in Massachusetts, of course. So as Trevor mentioned, I come at this as an art historian. So the field in which I'm engaged is a subfield of the study of transatlantic slavery, usually referred to as the visual culture of slavery. So my work then centers the lives, the experiences, and the representations through visual art and culture of enslaved people of African descent. And I mainly look at, or have looked at recently, Nova Scotia, Quebec, those two provinces in Canada, and Jamaica. Now, something I have to point out, of course, is that Canadians don't know that Canadian slavery existed for 2 centuries. Can I go to the first slide, please? And therefore, the rest of the world typically doesn't know that slavery existed in Canada either. So I'll let you read that while I'll give you some basic points here. So what happens with the erasure of Canadian slavery then, and both Indigenous people and people of Black African descent were enslaved in Canada for about 2 centuries. What we replace that with is a study of the Underground Railroad, of course, and it fits fairly well with our rhetoric, which is false, of Canada as a space that's racism free and race blind. So what the erasure of Canadian slavery does is to also absent the long history of Black Canadian presence, and to absent the fundamental role of anti-Black, anti-Indigenous racism in the nation building of Canada. So the other thing I want to point out is also that there's deep connections, as my colleagues have said, with Massachusetts, between Canadian slavery and the Caribbean, both Franco and Anglo, because we were a nation that was founded through the colonization of 2 empires, the British and the French. The other thing too, very similar to Massachusetts, is we're dealing with enslaved minority populations. Black enslaved populations and Indigenous were the minority of the population, outnumbered by white settlers, as certainly Black people were in terms of the enslaved populations. It was urban centered. We could not sustain an all-year plantation economy, of course, because of the weather. And what that provoked too are, through the drastic seasonal shifts, are very distinct practices of things like slave dress, slave nutrition, and also population size and potential of population congregation outside of invasive slave owner surveillance, and also very distinct processes in what we call the practices of creolization. Next slide, please. So in studying Canadian slavery then, next again, please. We're dealing with Ontario eastward, including all the way to Newfoundland, including in Nova Scotia, the island of Cape Breton. Next slide. And what we do in Canada instead, of course, is we celebrate and narrate ourselves only as anti-slavery activists through our recitation and embedding in the curriculum the study of the Underground Railroad. And many of you will know, of course, that is the period from 1834, when the British abolished slavery in all of its territories, which included us because we remained loyal, of course, during the War of 1812 and the Revolutionary War, to the end of the American Civil War in 1865. So we've been enshrined 31 years and celebrate 31 years and teach it from about grade 2 in Canada. And we teach nothing of the 200 years of slavery. So you can see the hypocrisy in that as well. Next slide. So we literally take ourselves off of the trade routes and the maps that record slavery. There should be trade routes, of course, going up from the Franco and Anglo-Caribbean to ports like Montreal, Quebec City, St. John's, and Halifax, where I am. Next slide. So very similar to Massachusetts, there were very many prominent white men who made their living not just through fur trade, as the mythology goes in Canada, but someone like James McGill, who was the founder of my former university, was actually also a West Indian merchant, trading in rum and sugar and molasses from Anglo-Caribbean islands like Jamaica. And of course, we know that those ships also had so-called secondary cargoes of enslaved Black human beings, both African-born and Creole, as my colleagues have already also mentioned. Next slide. So I'll just show you some of the evidence that we find, of course, in the archive in the form of the print culture in the 18th and 19th century newspapers of this deeply embedded connection between Canada and the Caribbean. So this, of course, a shipping ad with the captain advertising for freight and passengers. Next slide. The sale of the actual imported plantation produced and slave produced crops. Next slide. Again, similarly here, sugar. Next slide. And here, just as my colleagues mentioned, we haven't even estimated yet in Canada how many enslaved and free Black men were either forced or chose to be active in the shipping industry. But here, of course, Pompey, as a so-called sailor Negro slave, would have not had a choice working or being enslaved in the household of James Johnson and John Pearce, who were, like James McGill, West Indian merchants. Next slide. And here we see evidence of the so-called secondary cargo. Here is a West Indian merchant based in Halifax, Joshua Major, who's bringing in a shipment. And you know, the language of just imported, they've just arrived in Halifax, and he's trying to offload them very quickly. What's interesting here in the context of Nova Scotia is the term Creole was used in Canada to mean a Caribbean-born person. So we know that the ship that he's bringing in is coming, of course, from the Anglophone Caribbean. Also further down, what I think is interesting and disturbing is the so-called 2 Negro boys, 12 and 13 years old, likely healthy and well-shaped. Okay, why are they only speaking some English if they're coming from the Anglophone Caribbean? So this to me indicates very likely that they were born in Africa, did not have time to be creolized or acclimatized in the island in which they were first offloaded in the Caribbean before they were put on another ship by Joshua Major and sent north to Canada. So I think something that I really would like us to think about too is the nature of the extreme isolation and deprivation in terms of, isolation from self and community that was suffered by enslaved minorities in places like Canada, especially if you were African born. With whom did you speak your African language, preserve your African cultures and spirituality? Were you allowed to congregate? Were you allowed to create and play your African musical instruments, etc.? So we need to start to configure and conceptualize isolation as an additional force of trauma suffered by people in enslaved minorities. Next slide, please. So in terms of the nature of the sources, next slide, please. I'm sure they're very similar to what my colleagues are using in Massachusetts, in the American North. We're of course not thinking of something like this in Jamaica, plantation setting. Next slide. Neither are we thinking about the types of plantation ledgers that are typically found in the tropical or semi-tropical plantation context. This is something I used when I was working on my recent books on Jamaica. Next slide, please. Right? So we're typically bereft of this type of documentation when we're doing work on Canadian slavery. Next slide. So what we are encountering, though, that I'm sure my esteemed colleagues are encountering in Massachusetts are slave sale, slave auction, fugitive or runaway slave ads, and bills of sale. So here you can see that the abhorrent dehumanization of enslaved Africans in the context of Nova Scotia is such that this Black man, I mean, not named, no height, no labor type, he's just lumped in with a bunch of inanimate objects like ships, like horse, and also with animals like horses, etc. He's just one object to the auctioneer amongst many to be sold that day. So an extraordinary and horrific type of dehumanization. And I just want to point out for us too as scholars, how would we ever trace this man? We don't even have a name as a beginning point. So unless this auctioneer preserved those records, it would be extraordinarily difficult to recuperate his biography. Next slide, please. And again, there's a lot of slave sale ads for individual and small groups of enslaved men and women, and also children, of course. Next slide. And here, an example of a bill of sale. And of course, one of the actors in this bill of sale is a reverend. And we know as scholars and the general public, I think, knows to quite a large degree and extent that Christians were on both sides of slavery, both as pro-slavery advocates and as anti-slavery advocates. And here we have a bill of sale for a Black woman who's being called Dinah, being exchanged between these two white men in Halifax. Next slide. This one I find quite disturbing. We have a Black girl being sold by a slave owner named John Rock in Halifax, and he was unafraid to actually describe what was most likely the result of corporal punishment. Of course, it could be the lump above her eye, could have been a birth defect, it could have been a labor accident, etc. But if we're honest, we must add in there that the most likely reason for her lump above her right eye was probably that he physically assaulted her and hit her in the face shortly before she fled. And he's functioning, of course, with such impunity that he was unafraid to declare this in print in the newspaper as a further means of identifying and recapturing this Black girl named Thursday. Next slide. And sadly, how I found that slavery, that Thursday was caught was by going to John Rock's estate inventory and will. And we have, sadly, 2 years later, because Rock died before Thursday, she is listed and being evaluated as being worth, and this is again the objectification of enslaved people as chattel or movable personal property, as being valued at 20 pounds and being sold out of the estate to a man named John Bishop. Now, we all know too the horrific nature of slavery in terms of this dehumanization is for me then to further find evidence of Thursday. The best way to do that is not to look for traces of her in the archive, but to look for traces of her new owner, John Bishop. Okay, next slide. So just briefly, next slide. I just want to remind us that there was a 400-year archive, of course, of art and visual culture that was produced within the context of slavery. And this is where I, as an art historian, usually focus. So the portrait that you're seeing on the right is the only high art portrait fully finished we have of an enslaved person in Canada. And we know her identity. We believe her to be Marie Therese Amir. And the additional disturbing factor of this is that the artist, Francois, was not just the portraitist, but also the slave owner in this case. And we believe that he and his wife forcibly relocated her from Saint-Domingue on the eve of the Haitian Revolution. Next slide. So I put these juxtapositions, of course, just to have us see the decidedly distinct nature in which she is being represented, of course, as someone who was not a patron of her own likeness, who would not have had her own home to display the portrait, or the means and the cultural knowledge to even desire the portrait. So we need to think about the actual production of the portrait of the site as sexual and physical coercion. And of course, with her being forced then, it would not have been her choice to pose or to pose in this way, with the breast outside of the shirt, and offering of her body in its juxtaposition with the tray of tropical fruit is as a mechanism of hypersexualization, of course, which is part of the underpinning and the justification for the sexual exploitation and breeding of enslaved women across the Americas. Next slide. And just briefly, of course, in photography, this continues, and we have a plethora in places like the USA, Brazil, Cuba, where slavery was abolished quite late, of photographic images of enslaved women, often as caregivers, primary caregivers to white children. Next slide. And in Canada, even though we're outside of the period of slavery here, 1868, of course, very similar in terms of the structure and the nature of this image. Of course, here, more than likely, free Black domestic, but also in the role of caregiver to the white child. Next slide. And what we're bereft of in the archive are images like this of Black women mothering their own children. And let's just contemplate that for a moment, okay? That's what's almost completely absent and very, very difficult to find. Next slide. So getting towards the end here, next slide, please. So just to show the difference in the racial naming that occurred in terms of Blackness between a place like Jamaica that was, 6 or 7 prongs deep, and with Canada as just 3 different levels. And this is my evidence here is, of course, in my study of the slave ads in a place like Quebec. Next slide. And like I believe Jared pointed out and others, extraordinary diversity and heterogeneity in terms of what did Blackness mean in a place like Canada. In my own analysis of the Quebec ads, 50 of which have been found by the scholar Frank Mackey, who studies Quebec, I've been able to deduce at least these 3 and more, 4 categories. So definitely African-born people who sadly were never identified by ethnicity or nation. So we don't know where they were from, at least not from the fugitive or runaway slave ads, because typically it would only say Guinea accent or African-born. They wouldn't go into detail on ethnicity, as for instance, ads in a place like Jamaica. Next slide, please. And next slide. And just to conclude, just to show you some examples, of course, we know so much you can mine from fugitive slave ads. It's just a plethora of information because the slave owners were so bound and determined to get their so-called enslaved property back that they disclosed things that are often unhelpful to them to justifying the continuation of slavery as a supposed civilizing mission. Next slide. So just to highlight a couple issues, here we have a profound connection to slavery in the United States, of course. Slave owners typically in Canada, they often would say where the enslaved person who was fleeing was born, and oftentimes that where is a state in the USA. So here, the so-called mulatto Negro Andrew was born supposedly in Maryland, and interestingly too, he's being accused of fleeing with forged passes that misrepresent him as a free person. So of course, then it tells us there's a network of forgeries. Next slide. Here, an example of an African man, Ireland, and again, he's described as being from his native country, Guinea, and speaking no other language except that native language in English. And here to see the network of white slave owners who are pursuing and willing to help each other in the pursuit of enslaved people. Please note here, Gilliland is in New York State. He's publishing his ad in Quebec, in the Quebec Gazette, and he's saying that his buddies who are in Canada are the ones that you can appeal to get the $6 if you catch either man, the white indentured servant, or Ireland, the African enslaved man. Next. And here again, in the Revolutionary War, what happens? The white loyalists flee north. They force enslaved Africans, of course, to go with them. And then many of them then have so-called no use for them. And you have then the succession of ads where they're selling them, but they will actually name themselves as newly arrived loyalists. So we're able to deduce then where they're from and where the enslaved people, from where the enslaved people have been forced to migrate with them. Next slide. And here, just the ingenuity and the counter surveillance and the slave people are having to engage with. I think this is a really interesting example in the slave woman named Chloe, who escapes from an upper floor of the house of her slaver, Judah Joseph, by placing a ladder there when, of course, he didn't notice it for long enough for her to get out the window and then go off in with a man in a canoe that's waiting for her on the river. So I think this, again, when I talk about the slave ads giving details of things that were unhelpful to slave owners, this is a case in point. Next one, please, and almost done here. This one just to show, of course, that the law and the state were deeply involved. So this ad wasn't placed by a slave owner. It was placed by the sheriff and the jail keeper. And they're hunting an enslaved African man named Joe and a white criminal named John Peters, who have broken out of His Majesty's jail. Next slide. And here, in terms of the difference in the climate, of course, we have evidence, as documented by the slave owners, of damage to enslaved people's bodies and harm that came to them from the nature of the dramatic seasonal changes in the horrible cold winters. So here, Charles has, of course, lost parts of his toes to frostbite. And the next slide. And I'll just end here. This is the only example in the Quebec context of what looks like a Black family trying to escape together. Enslaved man named Robin or Bob, an enslaved Black woman. And what's interesting here is the 4-year-old girl Jane is named as a mulatta or a mulatto, which is actually, of course, a mixed race person. Her complexion implied here from that naming is lighter than both of the parents, which leads me to question if James Fraser, the slave owner, was her father. So do we have a case here where Fraser is hunting his enslaved mixed race child? And I'll leave that there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Charmaine. Finally, we turn to Mark Peterson, who is Edmund Morgan Professor of History at Yale University. Mark is a long-time specialist in the history of New England in a whole variety of ways. He calls himself a New England miniaturist, but writes very long books. The most important is a magisterial book, The City-State of Boston, in the Atlantic world between 1630 and 1865. Mark is now working on the Constitution and state making, and has a very wide knowledge of both American history and in particular of New England history. So, Mark, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much, Trevor, and to all of the folks at Hull who helped you organize this, and to our audience. I am going to use my time to make some framing remarks based on what our panelists have said already that I hope will be useful in generating questions and discussion. And so what I want to focus on is the most innocuous word in the title of this webinar, that is, if we're talking about slavery in Massachusetts, I want to focus on the word in. That is the problem of what it means for a complex and globe circling institution or practice such as slavery to be thought of in a little place like Massachusetts. So the point that I want to make is that all of the settler colonial societies of the Atlantic world, starting with the Spanish and Portuguese colonization in the late 15th, early 16th century, and then spreading to French and English and Dutch and all of the other forms of New World colonization, all of them were deliberately founded to be, let's call them relational societies across great distances. And in a way that the extant societies of Europe or of Africa or of indigenous America were not. Which is not to say that those places don't have long distance trading relationships, they do. But the foundation of these European colonies in the Americas were expressly designed to create new plantations or societies to capture the resources and exploit the resources of these distant places in order to bring them into the European center through long distance shipping or trade. And so the particular forms that slavery develops in the Americas, in the New World, is by and large a function of that relational quality, of the desire for large-scale production of commodities that were scarce or unknown in Europe, in the metropoles of these colonizing powers, and in order to enhance the wealth and in a sense get around the impediments to long distance trade that had been the earlier ways in which these commodities were required. So of course I'm talking about things like sugar and tobacco that become major staples of the slave societies of the New World. And so the big picture challenges that these colonial powers were facing was how to secure authority of one kind or another over the essential components, ingredients in this kind of commodity production. In other words, over land and labor. So for instance, if we're talking about land, well, essentially the methods by which Europeans gain land in the Americas is either through the use of force or violence of one kind or another, conquest, or through the creation or the development of relations of property and exchange with indigenous people in those lands of one kind or another. And especially the degree to which the first of those forms, but really both of them in one way or another, were encouraging of or conducive to the adaptation of enslavement as one way of doing this. And this is, of course, the kind of thing that Margaret Newell's book on 17th century New England and indigenous slavery does so brilliantly. It talks about the way in which the use of force and violence and the conquest of parts of New England, or even the commercial relationships that develop between English colonists and indigenous people, leads to the enslavement of individuals as indigenous individuals as part of this process. Of course, and quite obviously, the second aspect of this involves finding labor forces to produce commodities in large exportable profit-making volumes, right? And here, the question was really the extremely difficult one, which was how to encourage or convince people, the settler colonists of these new colonies, who themselves were often in a precarious position with respect to their own survival, to say nothing of prosperity. That is, colonizing itself was extremely difficult and dangerous and hazardous. And the question then became how to convince these settler colonists to produce far more of these kinds of commodities than they themselves could possibly use or even need, and for which the profits or benefits from these commodities would be realized by entrepreneurs, capitalists, whatever you want to call them, often thousands of miles away. And again, force and violence is one of the obvious ways in which you get people to do this sort of thing. The other is to create incentive structures of one kind or another that will, short of the worst kinds of force or violence that you see in slavery, bring that about. So if we now sort of focus in on Massachusetts, the point that I want to make is that in order to understand the way slavery is practiced there, you can't just look in Massachusetts, right? Because Massachusetts is one of the nodes in this large, at least transatlantic and really beyond, network of long distance commodity exchange on which this whole system runs. And Jared and Margaret have both mentioned this in one way or another. But the primary way in which Massachusetts becomes deeply involved in this does use force and violence in certain ways, but it also involves coming up with incentive structures for non-enslaved, for free or indentured people in Massachusetts to produce commodities, in this case, not rare and expensive things like sugar or tobacco or gold or silver or anything like that, although of course Massachusetts would have loved to have produced those things if it could, but rather humble commodities like salt fish, salted meats, grain products, timber products and the like, that become Atlantic commodities precisely because the tremendous output of sugar in West Indian islands like Barbados becomes so profitable that the planters there depend on other places like New England, or as Charmaine says, like eventually the Canadian provinces, to produce these humble commodities, to feed the slaves, to provide packaging materials for the shipment of sugar and for the processing of it and the like, right? And so what Massachusetts does, of course, it does rely on slavery to a certain extent, nowhere near to the extent in Massachusetts as you would find in a Jamaica or a Barbados or even a Virginia. But it develops incentive structures, market structures, so that English farming families that spread across New England can be paid in money, money generated by the profits of items like sugar, to overproduce, so that farm families will produce more, or raise more livestock, produce more corn and wheat, spend their evenings in the wintertime carving barrel staves and the like, far beyond anything for local use in New England, but to ship into this export system. So that's kind of what I want to add to this picture, a much larger overview of the complicated long-distance trade structures that are absolutely critical to generating the institution of slavery, and that, as Trevor Burnard has written about, always rely on force and violence for the creation of this system. But in Massachusetts, developed this quite interesting combination of non-slave incentive structures for this overproduction to combine with the kinds of indigenous slavery and small-scale use of African slavery that goes on right through the Revolutionary period. And I want to make one last comment about that and Gloria's fascinating work on the curious and in some ways difficult to describe end of slavery in Massachusetts. And the larger framing point I want to make about that is that, yes, Massachusetts is early in this Atlantic system. You might argue the first to abolish the institution of slavery in Massachusetts. But of course, it doesn't abolish Massachusetts' relationship to and dependence on this wider world of Atlantic slavery. And so the final comment I'd make is to say that what is striking to me in some ways was how little the actual abolition of slavery in Massachusetts changed the state's larger relationship to the wider world of slavery, which continues on for several decades in terms of the relationship between what Massachusetts produces and in particular the West Indian Islands. And then starting in the 18 teens, takes on a whole new turn as it develops an industrial textile making economy that, if anything, tightens the relationship of Massachusetts to the cotton kingdom of the American South. That even with the abolition of slavery in Massachusetts, the importance of slavery to Massachusetts grows through the first half of the 19th century. So I'll stop there because, above all, I'm interested in hearing people's questions and getting our conversation going. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mark. And perhaps I could invite the panel to join us again. Thank you very much for a very stimulating talk. And as you can imagine, it's provoked quite a number of questions. We've got about half an hour. Hopefully we'll get through a few of these, and please feel, if you're in the audience, feel free to send some other questions as well. I'll start with one with Judith Spixley, which is to the panel as a whole, based on a statement that Jared made. Jared said that slavery had unique characteristics in Massachusetts. And she asked, would all panelists like to say why, if you agree with this, and also reflects on what this says about the model we use for comparison. I'm not quite sure exactly what model she is thinking of, but the model that comes to mind for me is the one between the idea that there are slave societies where slavery is very dominant, and societies with slaves, places like Massachusetts and places like societies in Canada where slavery is not less important, but is less dominant, perhaps as an organization. So, who would like to start?
Well,
Jared, perhaps. Oh, sorry, Margaret.
Jared, if you wanna go first, that's fine. But I would say it's because Native Americans are the majority of the enslaved population for much of the 17th century, and a lot of slavery in Massachusetts is shaped around them. So I think beginning in the late 17th century, there's a push to bring the New England system in alignment with the system of slavery that has emerged, the law of slavery that has emerged in other English colonies. So of which the New England colonists are very aware. Everybody's in communication about this sort of shift to slavery and slave labor and the construction of these systems of enslavement. And the slaveholders want to bring the New England system in line, and they want to claim children. They want, they complain about the right to testify and all these other things. So that's the contest within the English colonial elites in Massachusetts and other colonies is over these questions that come up again and again and again. And because they don't do roll call votes in the proceedings of legal discussion of legislatures don't reveal the debate in the background. It's only if a participant talks about it in a diary or in a letter that this becomes apparent, or in legal cases involving a freedom suit or contestation over enslavement that this language and these expectations become clear. So I think, and this sort of also links to these questions that Mark and Gloria and Jared have all raised also about abolition. I think it's this sort of the very limited statutory framing of slavery in Massachusetts, which permits some of these practice, which doesn't make its hereditary equality clear, et cetera, entirely. Also means that they don't abolish by statute, and this puts a lot of the onus onto the enslaved person to claim their own freedom, so that you have a court case, but it doesn't automatically open the doors to everybody to walk away from slavery in 1783 or 1784. Jared, I'm sure he found the same thing. I still see people who are enslaved in the 1800s in Massachusetts. So Connecticut doesn't finally abolish slavery by statute until 1840. So I think you've got this very, very slow walk to making these questions clear for enslaved people. And I'm going to stop now, but I do want to talk more about what the Gloria's fascinating presentation too.
Great. Anyone else wanted to comment on that?
Can I just
Gloria,
complicate things and say,
Sure.
sorry, that in Quebec, New France first under the French, and then Quebec 1760 forward, Indigenous and Black people were also enslaved in chattel transatlantic slavery. I'm not talking about Indigenous forms of slavery. And the Indigenous people who were enslaved also outnumbered the Black people. So I'd like to see from the experts in Massachusetts, of which I know nothing, what would have been the distinction between those two regions, because in terms of the populations of who was enslaved and the proportion, it's very similar, right? And so the British too, who come in 1760, who are not enslaving under chattel slavery, Indigenous people in other parts of Canada, they're colonizing them, but they're not enslaving them, actually take up the French practice in New France when they rename the province Quebec. And in the Treaty of Capitulation, they actually stipulate all you French people who stay behind can keep your enslaved people, right? So I think, you know, there's room for further articulation of the uniqueness in terms of those two populations.
Well, I think one of the things that's happening in the 18th century, well, several things. One is the dramatic increasing importation of enslaved Africans is what's creating pressure in all of the New England colonies to bring the system more in alignment, to give slaveholders more rights over the enslaved, to move to a clear system of chattel slavery. But it also say in the 18th century, the British Empire, which supported slavery in every other respect in the colonial environment, starts walking back its position on Indigenous slavery and they engage in some mild critiques of Indigenous slavery in the 17th century, but this becomes really critical in this era of global imperial warfare between England and its imperial holdings and France and its imperial holdings. And the enslavement of Indigenous people starts presenting a real problem for the British, as if they don't recognize the personhood or they don't recognize soldiers on the other side of soldiers, and their own soldiers and civilians are subjected to captivity by the Wabanaki and other Indigenous groups. So there's a big discussion about this and pressure brought to bear on the New England colonies to stop enslaving captives and to treat their Indigenous populations better, because they're forming 20% of the provincial forces that New England's deploying against the French. So I think that we see that in the case of Indigenous people, the British imperial policy is moving towards, viewing them as subjects and therefore, not enslavable in the same way. So that could be where you see the French have the Code Noir. I mean, they have a law of slavery. The English, there's no central law. It is all generated by the colonies themselves. They're creating the legal environments. So that, so these are, I'd say that's one framework.
Another question, which comes from Rebecca Nelson, which talks about public history and heritage. And she asks, given the exciting advances in the historiography of slavery in Boston, do the panel feel the public historians will finally update their portrayal of slavery and public heritage to challenge what she calls the problematic narrative of Boston? So who wants to go with that one?
I can
Jared?
jump in, yeah, because my new book is actually based off a public history project. It came out of a public history project, the Mutiny on the Rising Sun, with the Old North Church and historic site in Boston, which of course is famous because on the night of April 18th, 1775, when Paul Revere was making his ride to warn that the British regulars were marching the next morning, that's where they hung the lanterns, the one if by sea, one if by land, two if by sea. So I didn't want to get that mixed up. And so it's long been seen as this kind of shrine of American liberty, a cradle of the Revolution. And yet, if you look at its 18th century congregation, it's full of slave traders, slave owners, and men deeply implicated in plantation provisioning and things like that. And so the story, the smuggling ring, the Mutiny on the Rising Sun, focuses on actually the Old North Church served as its social nexus for that smuggling ring that trafficked enslaved people and particularly enslaved children. So now the Order of the Church is sort of confronting that history, and they're in the process of sort of revising that signage. The signage in the place. They actually had a historic chocolate shop that was kind of part of this this interpretation. It was a very kind of quaint kind of American colonial revival thing where they taught you about how colonists consumed chocolate and didn't really talk much about the history, how chocolate's produced on plantations, how it's made in Boston largely, and certainly the man I study used enslaved labor to produce chocolate. So there is this move now to kind of tell a fuller history of the connection of these sites to enslavement, like I said, down to changing signage, an acknowledgement of it, building educational programs. So the Old North Church has quite a bit of outreach to primary and secondary school children. So changing their sort of programming to focus on the Old North Church's connections to slavery, both in Boston itself, because they had enslaved congregants that were segregated up in the galley of the church, but also it's this connection to the wider world of slavery. And you've seen this at a number of sites. There's been a huge debate, for example, over the name of Faneuil Hall. So if you've ever been to Boston, the sort of central tourist site and meeting place in Boston, Peter Faneuil was a slaveholder and a slave trader, slave owner and a slave trader. And so so do you keep this central place? Do you keep it named as a do you keep that name? And so these are discussions that are happening. You're seeing changes in individual sites. So yeah, it's definitely the conversation is changing and happening.
Yeah, I mean, I would just add that to the credit of many of these sites, they have been doing a good job on some of these issues for quite a while. The African Heritage Trail that especially explores the Beacon Hill region connected to the African Meeting House there on Joy Street. If anyone hasn't been on those, I highly recommend them. And at the moment, I'm on the advisory board of the Old South Meeting House and Old State House in Boston, and they are hyper aware of these issues as they're planning their way forward with programming and the like. So the word is getting out there.
Great. Thanks, Gloria.
I would just add that I've been in touch with many people, I'm sure the same kinds of people who are approaching Jared and Mark, and I've had conversations with the city archaeologists, and they're planning public programming to make the public more and more aware of the fact that Boston has a slave past, and it can be seen as a cradle of liberty and a cradle of slavery at the same time, and we can deal with those tensions in our public programming. So I think it's in process.
I have a question from Abigail Burnard for Charmaine in particular. She asked, this might be something that other people would want to chip in for Massachusetts, but she'd asked, do the Canadian articles, the evidence that you put forward, specify which tribe, or I guess perhaps which African nation the enslaved people may have belonged to?
Right, great question. Sadly, they don't, and it's so frustrating because typically how Africans are named, and I have to point out then that African-born people who became enslaved in Canada, of course, would have survived at least 2 middle passages or a middle passage and then secondary inland travel, because the slave ships did not come directly from Africa to any port in Canada. So first of all, we have to think about that type of trauma of multiple displacements. But the fugitive ads that are naming Africanness do so by language. So they'll say, like, for Ireland, he speaks no other language except other than English, except that of his country, Guinea. They'll say something like that, or they'll just say African born. So it's really frustrating because, when you work at a place like Jamaica or Haiti or a tropical location, the slave owners, of course, and the cultures of slavery there were so knowledgeable about African ethnicity. And I know, Trevor, you've commented on this, and others too who write about a place like Jamaica. Like, for instance, in Jamaica, planters were really deathly afraid of Coromantee enslaved people, and they would do, take ledgers that actually didn't just say, you know, the age or the name of the enslaved person, but the ethnicity as a way to track and map how many from certain ethnicities were on a certain plantation to try to avoid rebellion and unrest. But in Canada, no, where the ads at least are not helpful at all. So I'm hoping that with further research, perhaps personal or business correspondence or other things like that will reveal if slave owners even had that knowledge. And that's a big if. I think some of them did, but I think those who did would have understood that their fellow slave owners wouldn't have understood what the heck they were saying if they were to print something like my enslaved person who ran away was Igbo. So why print it? Because it wasn't common knowledge in the broader community. So then it becomes unuseful, unhelpful information. But thank you for that question.
Thanks. The question from Karen Okra, not only one in particular, and specifically, but she asks. She notes that most speakers reference the intercontinental British trade in enslaved people. I guess she's referring in particular to trade from the West Indies and other places of various races. And she asks, did this change after 1783? In other words, what difference did it make? What difference did independence make to the movement and trafficking of enslaved people?
Like Mark, do you want to jump in, or I can go?
Well, it becomes a lot more complicated, right? Because Britain itself shuts off trade between what's now the United States and its West Indian islands, and so the patterns that had been in existence for a century and more scramble, right? And so one thing that happens then, for instance, if you're looking at a place like Boston, its merchants take advantage of the opportunities they have, and suddenly Saint-Domingue becomes a place where many Boston merchants engage in the kind of trade that they had been doing with British islands for a long time. So, you know, that's one of the examples of the way in which the independent existence of the United States and the conflicts of Atlantic economy played out. Jared, are you going to?
Yeah, they remain invested in slavery, just kind of in different areas. So they ship to Saint-Domingue, they ship to Cuba quite extensively. Just to find really, they move extensively into kind of smaller markets, the plantation markets. So by the 18 teens, merchants from Salem, Massachusetts have effectively cornered the market in French Guiana. They're the most of the foreign trade in French Guiana is coming from Salem, which is kind of just an interesting aside. But you also see the way in which they involve themselves. It gets a little more complicated because of laws that are passed in Massachusetts restricting the slave trade, especially. And so one of the things I found is there's an extensive movement of merchants from Boston and other parts of seaports in Massachusetts to the Danish West Indies in the 1760s and 1770s, St. Croix, St. Thomas, and some of them become actual subjects of the King of Denmark. And what this allows them to do, it creates this legal fiction, in essence, that the ships they charter that are trafficking enslaved people, oftentimes to Cuba, become Danish ships, despite the fact that the owners are New Englanders. Many of them actually moved back to the United States later in their life. Jared Shattuck, who's from Connecticut, is a famous example of this. He's a major ironworks owner in Western Pennsylvania. So the market shift, yeah, there is this kind of, they're doing the same thing, just kind of in different places because of the restrictions placed on them in the British West Indies.
Great, thanks. The question, sorry, Margaret. Oh, Charmaine, sorry.
Oh, sorry. I just want to add briefly that this is a really important moment in the landscape of what becomes Canada, because we have the influx of 3,000 approximately newly freed African American and Africans in the so-called, who are documented in the so-called Book of Negroes, who were crossed to the British lines during the Revolutionary War. So, and very little study has been done on what impact that would have had on the already existing Black enslaved and free populations to have an influx of that extraordinary number of free Black and newly free Black people. So I think, you know, this moment too is very impactful for Canada. And again, about 10 years later, you have 500 Jamaican Maroons who are exiled to Nova Scotia. They don't stay very long because they agitate so much because they're so mistreated that majority of them actually end up being sent to Sierra Leone at their own request. But again, this is a very complex moment in terms of growing numbers of newly freed and freed Blacks in Nova Scotia.
Yeah.
Can I just add to that real quick? Sorry, Trevor. One of the interesting things is that as slavery is ending in Massachusetts, there's this movement. Slavery is becoming kind of delegitimated in Massachusetts. A number of enslavers move to sell enslaved people out. They see this last moment where they can make a little bit of money before they get slavery comes to a legal end. And one of the main markets for the people they're kidnapping or trafficking out of Massachusetts is Atlantic Canada. And so you're finding runaway ads in the say Nova Scotia newspapers that reference people trying to go back to New England where they had been trafficked from.
We can never underestimate people's avidity and cupidity, can we? There's a question for Gloria from Mary Floyd, but there might also be something which applies to other speakers. But one of the things she noted was that all the presentations, and you mentioned it particularly, Gloria, were extremely rich in terms of the source material that was able to be used. And what she asked was, does the richness of the source material about enslaved people, which was true from what Charmaine, Margaret, Jared all put forward, and you yourself, Gloria, does it say something about slavery in Massachusetts, or does it say something about the nature of the sources? In other words, I think what she's trying to say is if we had these sorts of sources for other places, would we also have a sort of as richer portrait of slavery in Massachusetts as we do, or is there something particular about Massachusetts that makes the sources so rich? Chicken, egg, you know.
That's a very good question, Mary. And Jared spoke to this too in his presentation when he talked about how the source base that we have is in many cases the richest of all the Anglo-Atlantic prior to the 19th century in terms of its representation of Black lives and Black people's voices. And I think that the answer to Mary's question, perceptive question, is both. I mean, New Englanders generated, and all of my this has been clear on all the presentations, but New Englanders generated an enormous array of written materials. And then New Englanders compulsively saved much of this generation upon generation, in part convinced of how important what they were doing in New England was to the broader, national project in the after the Revolution. So we have many sources that were generated and many have saved, and that's because of the fact that, I mean, that's in large part because of the record keeping practices of colonists and their descendants. But I do think, I mean, some of the sources where you have people of African descent making claims, submitting petitions themselves, whether or not, in certain instances in their own hand, in other instances they've gotten somebody to help them with the project. But I think there is more of a, and there's been some work done on this. I mean, Jared's done work on this. There are higher literacy rates among people of African descent. There's a sense that people that Black people can testify in court. There's an understanding of sort of personhood, and Black people take full advantage of the tools at their disposal to put their requests out there and try to shape their own future in whatever way they can. So I think part of the richness of the material is just because of colonial record keeping practices and record saving practices, and part of it is due to the things that the strategic decisions that Black people made with the resources that they managed to cobble together on the ground in 17th and 18th century New England, and also Native people.
Great. I'll take the liberty of asking the final question myself, and it refers from the first thing that Margaret said in the first sentence, which is about New England exceptionalism, which is such an important part of the history of America. And I guess, Charmaine, as well, in terms of, you talked about certain ways of Canadian exceptionalism in terms of the Underground Railroad and things like that. We're aware that in things like the 1619 project of the New York Times, that a lot of people, or some people anyway, and it's a very much debated thing in America at the moment, want to rethink about American history less about being the story of liberty, in which Boston looms pretty large, but to be about the history of slavery, in which maybe New England doesn't loom as large as other parts of the Americas. What does things like the 1619 Project mean for stories of exceptionalism if we think about how important slavery is in Massachusetts? Is New England still exceptional? I guess it's a short question.
It never was.
Never was. Okay.
Is the short answer.
Margaret, do you have thoughts? You raised the idea of New England exceptionalism.
I think Mark's right. I think what all of this new research does is puts New England into Atlantic and global context and put it in play with, so the Southwest, explains the rest of United States history too. I think it's a moment of correction too. I think those narratives, the other narratives are still there. The political, the cultural and religious narratives are there. But this was an incredible omission. So this is, and as scholars, our charge is to try to be original and to discover new things. So I think we have all this material, and now we have to figure out how to tell the story, how to integrate it into the whole story, and how that changes the whole story. So I think this is the political moment we find ourselves in the U.S. with. My home state of Ohio is about to pass a law that say that we're not supposed to, the public school teachers can't teach controversial subjects. What are we to do? I think let's just keep doing what we're doing.
Well, that's a great way to.
Facts, the friend of mine says.
You won't be able to mention the state of Michigan in your classes, right? But exceptionalism can mean one of two things. It can mean either exempt from the ordinary forces of history. That's how Stalin used it to describe American exceptionalism in the early 20th century. Or it can mean like special, better than the rest, whatever. And that's what I meant when I said New England has never been either of those things, right? It developed differently from other places, sure, but not because it was exempt from the forces that shaped other places. It's just that those forces work differently in different environments. And as I think all of the work from today's panelists show, it's not that it's better than other places with respect to either slavery or liberty. It's part of a large, complex process that we're doing a much better job of understanding these days. So, exceptionalism away.
Okay, well, that's a great way to end. I think we've learned a great deal about Canada, about New England, about that fascinating part of the northern part of North America during the 17th and 18th century, and how important slavery was then and is in its legacies today. I was hoping that there might be more controversy, there might be a bit more blood on the floor in this way, but you're all very civilized, which is disappointing. But we've had any number of people who've been in the audience have written how much they've appreciated what you've been writing about, what you've been saying today, and I'd just like to give my thanks to you as well. This has been a really illuminating and inspiring session, and I think it shows just that there's a lot of really interesting new work on Massachusetts, on New England, on Canada, and that will continue. So thank you very much to our panelists on behalf of the Wilberforce Institute and also on behalf of the audience. Thank you. Enjoy your evening or morning, in your case, Jared.
Thank you all.
Thank you so much for organizing, and thanks to the whole staff for putting this together and helping us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.